Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to join in this moment, this immersion in words, wisdoms, and relationships of Torah. We are in Parshat Ekev, which begins in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 7 with verse 12. And I invite everyone to go ahead and unmute at this moment, and together we can recite our blessing for this opportunity of sharing Torah with one another. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for this opportunity of immersing ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 7. That's a different edition. So maybe Richard could help you find Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 17. I'll share with you the opening verses, and then I'll invite people around the table here to read a few verses, and then we'll invite people who are online to share some verses as well, and then we'll have our little bit of discussion. So chapter 7, verse 17.
17, not 12?
Oh. I'm sorry, verse 12, thank you.
It's a good thing I was here tonight.
Thank you. And if you do obey these rules and observe them carefully, Adonai your God will maintain faithfully for you the covenant that God made on an oath with your ancestors. God will favor you and bless you and multiply you. God will bless the issue of your womb and the produce of your soil, your new grain and wine and oil, the calving of your herd and the lambing of your flock, in the land that God swore to your ancestors to assign to you. You shall be blessed above all other peoples. There shall be no sterile male or female among you or among your livestock. Adonai will ward off from you all sickness. God will not bring upon you any of the dreadful diseases of Egypt about which you know, but will inflict them upon all your enemies. We're now on verse 16. Danny, would you like to read a little bit, starting at verse 16?
Yes. You shall destroy all the people that the eternal your God delivers to you, showing them no pity, and you shall not worship their gods, for that would be a snare to you. Let me know when you want me to stop.
Sure, keep going.
Should you say to yourselves, these nations are more numerous than we, how can we dispossess them? You need have no fear of them. You have but to bear in mind what eternal your God did to Pharaoh and all the Egyptians, the wondrous acts that you saw with your own eyes, the signs and the portents, the mighty hands and the outstretched arm by which the eternal your God liberated you. Thus will be the eternal your God do to all the people you now fear. The eternal your God will also send a plague against them until then those who are left and hidden perish before you. Do not stand in dread of them, for the eternal your God is in your midst, a great and awesome God.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much. Richard, do you want to read at verse 22?
Thank you. The Lord your God will dislodge those people before you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them at once, else the wild beasts would multiply to your hurt. The Lord your God will deliver them up to you, throwing them out in utter panic until they are wiped out. He will deliver their kings into your hand, and you shall make their name vanish from under the heavens. No man shall stand up to you until you have wiped them out. You shall consign the images of their gods to the fire. You shall not covet the silver and gold on them and keep it for yourselves, lest you be ensnared thereby. For that is abhorrent to the Lord your God. You must not bring an abhorred thing into your house, or you will be proscribed like it. You must reject it as abominable and abhorrent, for it is proscribed.
Thank you. Zippy, would you like to read a little bit at the beginning of chapter 8?
I have to find it first.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Wait.
We just have to turn the page in this direction. and get to
I had it for a while.
Mhm.
Okay, let me, we'll come back to Zippy.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll come back.
Steve, would you like to read a little bit, the very start of chapter 8?
You
got it.
you shall faithfully observe all the instructions that I enjoin upon you today, that you may thrive and increase and be able to possess the land that the Lord promised on oath to your fathers. Remember the long way that the Lord your God made you travel in the wilderness these past 40 years, that he might test you by hardships to learn what was in your hearts, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He subjected you to the hardship of hunger and then gave you manna to eat, which neither you nor your fathers had ever known, in order to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but that man may live on anything that the Lord decrees. The clothes upon you did not wear out, nor did your feet swell these 40 years. Bear in mind that the Lord your God disciplines you just as a man disciplines his son. Therefore, keep the commandments of the Lord your God, walk in his ways, and revere him.
Thanks, Steve. Sherry, do you want to read a little bit there at verse 7?
Just pass.
Okay, thank you. Zippy, would you like to read at verse 7 there?
Yeah, for your Lord God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, of wine, figs and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat food without streams, where you will lack nothing, a land whose rocks are iron and from whose hills you can mine copper. When you have eaten your fill, give thanks to your Lord God for the good land given to you.
Thank you so much. And then June, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 11?
Thank you, Rabbi. Beware lest thou forget the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his ordinances and his statutes, which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art satisfied and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thy heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, who brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, who led thee through the great and dreadful wilderness, wherein were serpents, fiery serpents, and scorpions, and thirsty ground where was no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might afflict thee, and that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy latter end. And thou say in thy heart, my power and the might of my hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore unto thy fathers, as it is this day. Should I continue?
Please, why don't you just finish the rest of chapter 8?
Okay, and it shall be, if thou shalt forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I forewarn you this day, that ye shall surely perish. As the Lord nations that the Lord maketh to perish before you, so shall ye perish, because ye would not hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God.
Thank you so much, June. And let me ask, Mark Thompson, would you like to read beginning at the start of chapter 9?
Thank you, Rabbi. Hear, O Israel, you are about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and more populous than you, great cities with walls sky high, a people great and tall, the Anakites, of whom you have knowledge, for you have heard it said, who can stand up to the children of Anak? Know then this day that none other than Adonai your God is crossing at your head, devouring fire. It is he who will wipe them out. He will subdue them before you, that you may quickly dispossess and destroy them, as Adonai promised you. And when Adonai your God has thrust them from your path, say not to yourselves, the Lord has enabled us to possess this land because of our virtues. It is rather because of the wickedness of those nations that Adonai is dispossessing them before you. It is not because of your virtues and your rectitude that you will be able to possess their country, but it is because of their wickedness that Adonai your God is dispossessing those nations before you, and in order to fulfill the oath that Adonai made to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Thank you, Mark. Let me invite Tom and Jackie. Would you like to read a little bit, starting at verse 6? And you'll have to unmute. Thank you.
Know then that it is not for any virtue of yours that the eternal your God is giving you this good land to possess. For you are a stiff-necked people. Remember, never forget how you provoked your God, Adonai, to anger in the wilderness. From the day that you left the land of Egypt until you reached this place, you have continued defiant toward Adonai. At Horeb, you so provoked Yud-Heh-Vah-Heh that the Eternal was angry enough with you to have destroyed you. I have ascended the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant that Adonai had made with you. And I stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, eating no bread and drinking no water. And Adonai gave me the 2 tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God, with the exact words that the Eternal had addressed to you on the mountaintop, out of the fire on the day of the assembly.
At the end of 40 days and 40 nights, the Eternal gave me 2 tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant. And the Eternal One said to me, hurry, go down here hence at once, for the people whom you brought out of Egypt have acted wickedly. They have been quick to stray from the path that I have enjoined upon you. They have made themselves a molten image. The Eternal said to me, I see that I have a stiff-necked people. Let me alone and I will destroy them and blot their name from under heaven. And I will make you a nation far numerous than they.
Thank you both so much. Margot, would you like to read starting at verse 15?
Thank you. I started down the mountain, a mountain ablaze with fire, and the 2 tablets of the covenant in my 2 hands. I saw how you sinned against the Lord your God. You had made yourselves a molten calf. You had been quick to stray from the path of the Lord had enjoined upon you. Therefore, I gripped the 2 tablets and flung them away with both my hands, smashing them before your eyes. I threw myself down before the Lord, eating no bread, drinking no water, 40 days and 40 nights as before, because of the great wrong you had committed, doing what displeased the Lord and vexing him. Should I finish that?
Sure.
For I was in dread of the Lord's fierce anger against you, which moved him to wipe you out. And that time too, the Lord gave heed. Moreover, the Lord was angry enough with Aaron to have destroyed him. So I also interceded for Aaron at that time. And for the sinful things you made the calf, I took it and put it to the fire. I broke it to bits and ground it thoroughly until it was fine as dust. And I threw the dust into the brook that comes down from the...
Thank you so much, Margot. Susan,
Sure.
David, would you like to read starting at verse 22?
Thank you. I'd love to. Again, you provoked Adonai at Taberah and at Massah and at Kibroth Hattavah. And when Adonai sent you on from Kadesh Barnea, saying, go up and take possession of the land that I am giving you, you flouted the command of your God Adonai, whom you did not put your trust in nor obey. As long as I have known you, you have been defiant toward Adonai.
So I prostrated myself in front of Hashem for the 40 days and 40 nights that I had fallen down because Hashem had said he would destroy you. And I prayed to Hashem and said, my Lord Hashem, don't destroy your people and your legacy, whom you redeemed by your greatness, whom you brought out from Egypt with a strong hand. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Don't look to this people's hardness and to its wickedness and to its sin, or else the land from which you brought us out will say, because Hashem wasn't able to bring them to the land to which he spoke to them, and because he hated them, he brought them out to kill them in the wilderness. And they're your people and your legacy, whom you brought out from by your great power and by your outstretched arm.
Thank you both so much. Mark Levenstein, would you like to read a little bit at the start of chapter 10?
Thank you. Therefore the Lord said to me, carve out 2 tablets of stone like the first, and then come up to me on the mountain and make an ark of wood. Excuse me. I will inscribe on the tablets the commandments that were on the first tablets that you smashed, and you shall deposit them in the ark. I made an ark of acacia wood and carved out 2 tablets of stone like the first. I took the 2 tablets with me and went up the mountain. The Lord inscribed on the tablets the same text as on the first, the 10 commandments that he addressed to you on the mountain out of fire on the day of assembly. And the Lord gave them to me. Then I left and went down from the mountain, and I deposited the tablets in the ark that I had made, where they still are, as the Lord had commanded me.
Thank you, Mark. Let me invite Cheryl. Would you like to read a little bit, starting at verse 6?
Thank you, Rabbi. From Beeroth Bene Jaakan, the Israelites marched to Moserah. Aaron died there and was buried there, and his son Eleazar became priest in his stead. From there, they marched to Gugad, and from Gugad to Jobath, a region of running brooks. At that time, Adonai set apart the tribe of Levi to carry the ark of Adonai's covenant, to stand in attendance upon Adonai, and to bless in God's name, as is still the case. That is why Levi has received no hereditary portion along with its kin. Adonai is its portion, as your God Adonai spoke concerning it. I had stayed on the mountain as I did the first time, 40 days and 40 nights, and Adonai heeded me once again. Adonai agreed not to destroy you. And Adonai said to me, up, resume the march at the head of the people, that they may go in and possess the land that I swore to their fathers to give them.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Barry, would you like to read a little bit at verse 12?
Yes, Rabbi. And now, O Israel, what does Adonai your God demand of you? Only this, to revere your God, to walk in his paths, to love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, keeping Adonai's commandments and laws, which I enjoin upon you today for your good. Mark, the heavens to your utmost reaches belong to Adonai your God, the earth and all that is on it. Yet it was to your fathers that Adonai was drawn in his love for them, so that he chose you, their lineal descendants, from among all peoples, as is now the case. Cut away, therefore, the thickening about your hearts. Stiffen your necks no more. For Adonai your God is God supreme and Lord supreme, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who shows no favor and takes no bribe, but upholds the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and befriends the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. You too must befriend the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. You must revere Adonai your God. Only him shall you worship. To him shall you hold fast, and by his name you shall swear. He is your glory, and he is your God. Who wrought you for these marvelous, awesome deeds that you saw with your own eyes? Your ancestors went down to Egypt, 70 persons in all. And now Adonai your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven.
Thank you so much, Barry. Let me invite Justin. Would you like to read a little bit at the start of chapter 11?
Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God, keep his charge, his statutes, his ordinances, and his commandments all the days. And you shall know this day that I speak not with your children who did not know and who did not see the chastisement of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, his outstretched arm, his signs and his deeds, which he performed in the midst of Egypt to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his entire land, and what he did to the army of Egypt, to its steeds, to its chariots. He caused the waters of the Red Sea to inundate them when they pursued you, and the Lord destroyed them to this day. And what he did for you in the desert until you arrived at this place, and what he did to Datan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, the son of Reuben, that the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, and their households and their tents and all the possessions at their feet in the midst of all Israel. But your eyes, which have seen all the great work of the Lord, which he did.
Thank you so much. Just let me invite Dave, if you'd like to read starting at verse 8.
Keep therefore all the instruction that I enjoin upon you today, so that you may have the strength to enter and take possession of the land that you are about to cross into and possess, and that you may long endure upon the soil that the Lord swore to your fathers to assign to them and to their heirs, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. It is a land which the Lord your God looks after, on which the Lord your God always keeps his eye from year's beginning to year's end. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rains for your land in season, early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil, and I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill. Take care not to be lured away and serve other gods and bow to them, for the Lord's anger will flare up against you, and he will shut up the sky so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is assigning to you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Verse 18. Therefore, impress these my words upon your very heart. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. And teach them to your children, reciting them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. And inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, to the end that you and your children may endure in the land that God swore to your ancestors to assign to them, as long as there is heaven over the earth. If then you faithfully keep all this instruction that I command you, loving Adonai your God, walking in all God's ways, and holding fast to God, God will dislodge all before you, all these nations. You will dispossess nations greater and more numerous than you. Every spot on which your foot treads shall be yours. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness to the Lebanon, and from the river, the Euphrates, to the western sea. No one shall stand up to you. Adonai your God will put the dread and fear of you over the whole land in which you set foot, as God promised you. That's our entire Torah portion for this week. I'd like to share with you a little bit of focus study, and then we'll open up for everyone to share their reflections, observations, and provocations. Yes, Daniel, there you go. Anyone else around this table here need a study sheet? Okay, very good. So first, I'd just like to begin by looking at the painting that I have on the study sheet. It's a painting called Pivot. It's a painting by George L.K. Morris. George L.K. Morris was an American painter. He was an abstract expressionist. He lived from about 1905 until 1975. And he was advocating for the adoption of an abstract form of art from as early as the 1930s and 1940s. And he sought to develop this form of art as a uniquely American form of art, as a way to bring kind of what he saw as universal truths into a unique situation of the United States. So I'd like to begin just by quoting a little bit from our artist and see how what he said about his painting applies to what we've been reading in this week's Torah portion. And then towards the end, we'll come back to his painting and look specifically at his painting to see what it might reveal to us. So here's what George L.K. Morris wrote about his work. He said, "There is nothing new about the quality that we have come to call abstract. In great works of the past, there has always been a dual achievement, the plastic or structural on the one hand, and the literary on the other." So just by way of orientation to the material that we're going to look at on the rest of the study sheet, what George Morris is referring to in terms of this dual aspect of a work of art. He refers, first of all, to the plastic element. And by the plastic element, he means the actual physical framework, the structure that the visual art is now working within. And then in addition to the actual formal structure, the physical materials that the artist is working with, there's also this other aspect that he calls the literary, by which I think he means the story that the artist is trying to tell in some way, the narrative, the internal experience and vision of the artist as it is then comes to be realized within the structural work of the materials and the framing. So let's take a look and see how this applies, or what this helps us understand about what's in this week's Torah portion, this notion of a dual achievement between the structural and the literary. So we've talked before about this notion that in Deuteronomy, there is this particular unique vocabulary of language that highlights how the kind of vocabulary that's necessary to enter into this covenantal relationship with God, and then to realize that covenantal relationship in particular by crossing over the Jordan and settling in the land. So the first word that comes up is this notion of memory. We've talked about this, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that memory and remembering is a key term that appears within Deuteronomy, and that certainly is the case here. And when we talk about memory, we're talking about something that's very different than history. And to help us get into this notion of a distinction between memory and history, at least within the Jewish tradition, I'd like to share with you this quote by Yosef Yerushalmi, who was a great Jewish historian, taught at Columbia University. And he wrote a very significant and yet short book called Zachor, which means remember or memory. He said this: "Only in Israel and nowhere else is the injunction to remember felt as a religious imperative to an entire people. Memory is always problematic, usually deceptive, sometimes treacherous. Yet the Hebrew Bible seems to have no hesitations in commanding memory. Its injunctions to remember are unconditional, and even when not commanded, remembrance is always pivotal." Oh, look, there's that, I just realized there's that word pivotal And the title of our painting above is Pivot. We'll see how we can play with that. But what Yerushalmi is saying is memory is very different than history. And in fact, he and others have remarked upon how in Judaism, for centuries and centuries, even though events of the past are being described, the way they're being described is what we today call ahistorical. That is, it's really less concerned with specific dates and what other aspects of what a historian might be interested in, like, well, exactly what kind of weapons did people carry? On exactly what date of the year did certain events happen? Exactly what were the nature of how these other peoples that are being described, how did they live? What were their economies and so forth? Those are some of the aspects that a historian would be looking at. That's not what is being recalled here, according to Yerushalmi. What's being recalled in this memory has to do with the nature of an experience and how people understood that experience and the meaning that they drew from that experience. And let's look at how this notion about memory comes up in this week's Torah portion. So this is B under number 2 on our study sheet. And this is from this week's Torah portion. When you have eaten and are satisfied, bless Adonai your God for the good land God has given you. Be careful that you do not forget Adonai your God, failing to observe God's commands, laws, and decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud and you will forget Adonai your God. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this great wealth for me. But remember Adonai your God, for it is God who gives you the power to produce wealth, and so confirms the covenant God swore to your ancestors as it is today. So here we have at this message seems to be that at moments of our great success, at moments of our triumph, we have a tendency to lose sight of the values that we fought for. And in our tradition, those include a sense of justice, independence, freedom, increasing equality, and as a result, we tend to lose sense of social solidarity. People become increasingly detached from one another, increasingly have less of a sense of obligation and responsibility towards one another. People become more concerned with what they themselves have achieved rather than what their obligation and their part within this covenant is, which is sought to be fulfilled here by the settling in the land. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in an article on this week's Torah portion, wrote that the test of a nation is not if it can survive a crisis, but if it can survive the lack of a crisis. He says when there's a great challenge that faces a group of people, there's a tendency for people to come together to try and figure out how to solve the problem. But when there is no crisis, when everything is going fine, when everything is successful, then people kind of become relaxed about their obligations towards one another. And that's when nations have the possibility for deteriorating and falling apart. I want to point out that what we just read in terms of the text, this from chapter 8, this is the scriptural basis for Birkat Hamazon. This is the blessing that we are to recite after we have eaten a meal. Once we have sated ourselves, once we are full and happy, and we need to eat no more because we've had enough, that's the moment at which the tradition says, this is a very important moment in which you need to give thanks for everything that you've eaten, because otherwise you might forget. You might forget that all this food, all this bounty, everything in existence is not merely the work of your hands, it also has a partner in everything that exists. And it's important to remember that partner. So this is, if you will, a mechanism of memory to remember something very fundamental, which is that we're in covenant with another power. And we have an obligation to remember that other partner. So here is some more examples of memory as they appear within this week's Torah portion. So first is from an earlier reference to what we're going to read about in just a moment. And that is from Exodus chapter 13, verse 9. And it says, "This shall serve you as a sign on your hand, zikaron, between your eyes," a form of remembering, a remembrance between your eyes. So of course, that's referring to what we read about also in our Torah portion out of chapter 11. "Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them be bands between your eyes, and teach them to your children." So of course, this is referring to tefillin. And as we put the two together from Deuteronomy and Exodus, what we see is the tefillin, the boxes with verses from Torah that are worn here on the forehead and around the arms and the hand. These are memory boxes. These are designed to help us constantly remember why we're here, what our mission is, where power truly comes from, and how to use that power in a way that's sacred and brings holiness into the world. So Adam Kirsch, who's a contemporary writer, wrote an article called "Only Jewish History is So Hard to Write." And he wrote this in that article: "Judaism is a technology of memory, a set of practices designed to make the past present." So again, what Adam Kirsch is reminding us is that history and memory are very different things. History, if you will, is a recitation of events that have taken place with dates, places, very detailed descriptions of things that have happened. Adam Kirsch suggests that memory is very different. Memory as it operates within Judaism is very different. It's designed to make the past present. It's designed to help us see things that are ongoing. And indeed, that is the very nature of our Passover Seder, which is perhaps our greatest yearly kind of history lesson, if you will, or memory lesson, especially that we're to transmit to our children. So if memory is one of the key parts of this week's Torah portion and of Deuteronomy in general, let's go on to a second one, which is hearing. So if you, again, when we discussed Parshat Devarim, we noted the covenantal language that appears in Deuteronomy, and those are words having to do with listen, love, remember, transmissions of a heritage. And at that time, we noted that Shema, the verb that gets translated as listen, occurs at least 92 times in Deuteronomy, making it an absolutely key word within our book Devarim. So here we are, we see it in this week's Torah portion, the beginning of chapter 9. Shema Yisrael, you're about to cross the Jordan. And then later in chapter 11, if you Shema Tishim the directions that I direct to you today. So there's an emphasis placed on this notion of hear or listen. So then the question is, well, what is the nature of this hearing or listening? So now let's again step back to Exodus to see a very interesting distinction about what it means in the Jewish tradition to, if you will, Shema, to hear. So we have in chapter 24 of the book of Exodus, this moment at Sinai. And the word Shema appears there in a very interesting way. So first, chapter 24, verse 3, at this moment of Sinai, this moment of revelation, all the people answered as one, saying, all the matters that God has spoken, we will do. Then 4 verses later, it says, and they said, all that God has spoken, we will do and we will hear. Very close in what each of those verses are saying, with some interesting distinctions. The first one, all the people answered as one. So the commentators say, what's happening here is the people are unified in saying everything that God has said, we're going to do. There was a sense of unanimity, a consensus that how we are to act, what we're supposed to do, how we are to behave. There was an agreement about behavioral norms. Okay? That notion about answering as one is absent from the later verse in verse 7. And they said, all that God has spoken, we will do, and we will hear. Commentators say, here's the difference. We add this notion about hearing, and absent is this notion about unanimity, a consensus. And so the commentators say, what this means is we have agreed to be unified in our behavioral norms, but not in our thinking. In fact, diversity of thought, having different perspectives, having different ideas is encouraged. So this notion about hearing is not about obeying. In fact, in biblical Hebrew, there is no word to obey. So this notion about hearing has to do with the stimulation of our unique thoughts, perspectives, and perceptions. Aviva Zornberg, one of the greatest living commentators today on Torah, says this about hearing. To hear is to open up to vulnerability, change, contingency. And then Rabbi Jonathan Sachs takes that very same concept and frames it very beautifully. He says, listening to another human being, let alone God, is an act of opening up to a mind radically other than our own. This takes courage. To listen is to make myself vulnerable. It's the people not like us who make us grow. So if you flip back over to the front side of our study sheet, this tension that we're hearing, that we are kind of reading through here in our study sheet between memory, which is some kind of vehicle for recalling what has happened and for transmitting what has happened as a way to perpetuate and further and strengthen a sense of heritage, tradition, rootedness, and so forth, is now in some kind of tension with something else, which is called hearing, which is to bring newness into the world. So here's this tension between, if you will, tradition and innovation, or as the title of the study she says, between continuity and disruption. So let's look at George Morris's painting here. I chose it first because of this word pivot, because this notion about this pivotal moment that the Israelites are on, standing there at the border of the River Jordan. What could happen? They could either cross over, or they could all head back to Egypt, or maybe just dissolve in the spot that they are and not move forward at all. So here in the painting, as I noticed something interesting, even after I had chosen it, which is this: you have this bifurcated figure in the middle there. It looks to me like I would describe them as kind of two perhaps tops kind of on top of one another with a space between them. And so in that sense, this figure in the middle has been bifurcated. It's been split in half and separated. So there's the disruptive dynamic that's happening. And yet there is this line that connects the two pieces, that's holding it together. And so in that sense, what George Morris is conveying to me, in any case, is this constant dynamic of something splitting apart and yet being pulled back together, splitting apart and being pulled back together. This, I want to suggest, is one of the great driving forces within the Jewish tradition, which is a healthy tension between continuity and disruption, between tradition and innovation, between memory and hearing. So with that, I'd love to open it up and hear what other people were hearing and seeing, either in the painting, in our text, and what was occurring to you and what you were experiencing during reading. So if you'd like to, go ahead, Margot.
Okay, Rabbi, despite your displeasure with our reading the Torah as a historical document, I can't help it. I'm married to a man who, as you know, is a historian. So what I'm focusing on is it said 70 people came to Egypt. And was it from those 70 people that the great nation grew?
Yes, what do you think about that?
I think it's amazing.
Amazing. It is amazing. Okay.
It's amazing. I assume that swarms of people came up with Joseph's family, but obviously not. And so from 70 people, a great nation grew.
So maybe we'll have a little bit of discussion about what might have nurtured such an explosion of a population from 70 to perhaps 600,000 or more over the course of generations, okay?
Yeah.
But it is amazing, I agree.
Yeah, and one more thing, if I may.
Of course.
You talked about Birkat Hamazon. That brings memories to me of growing up in Camp Ramah, where we sang it after every meal. And I was wondering, as a favor, as we fade out tonight, if Mark Thompson could, I love it. I love the Birkat Hamazon. And if Mark Thompson could maybe sing a little bit of it to us as we fade out tonight. That's just a favor of Mark.
How lovely. I'm sure whatever Mark blesses us with, I'm sure he feels so pleased that you've recognized him that way. Thank you, Margot. Okay. And others want to share, have some thoughts? Okay, and Steve?
Yeah, this doesn't deal with the Jewish people per se, but the George Floyd thing is a remembrance. I mean, you could get into all of the history and the details and who did what, but it's sort of like the remembrance started a Black Lives Matter, which swept the whole country.
Interesting, right? So you can either, as you said, focus on the details and as a historian trying to analyze exactly what happened when, or you could view it somewhat differently, which is try and draw from it your experience of that moment, what meaning you drew from that event. And that seems to be what's being talked about in this distinction by Yerushalmi about the difference between being a historian and being a memorist, if you will.
I really like that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Richard and then Daniel. And talk a
The
little.
point is that to remember, Zakor, is to re-engage the affect, not to recall the incident.
Can you say one? Yes, say one more time.
Remembrance, Zakor, is to re-engage the affect, to be present with the affect, and incidental to recalling the particularities intellectually of the event.
Right.
But one is hearing God, remembering, oh, this is who I am. I'm sated. I can stop eating now. I don't have to expand myself. I'm thankful and I'm back with my thankfulness, not with my continuing to go for my next meal.
I love that. We don't have to continue expanding. I don't have to continue expanding myself. That's a lovely image. Thank you. Hey, Daniel, what you got to share?
Yeah, so I would say that in my urban studies program, one of the big debates going on in the social sciences right now is this conflict between history and being a memorist. And a lot of it is being driven by like the George Floyd and stuff like that. But I think a lot of it is that there does seem to be a lot, and I'm more on the side of memorist versus history, that there is a real impetus right now to focus more on people's experiences, making meaning, all of that stuff, and really focusing on the perspective, particularly from the point of view of the groups being oppressed, and also how the past and the present are related. I mean, when I was younger, when I first was in school and graduate, there was a lot of emphasis on separating the past and present. Now I guess probably in relation to ecology and evolution, I guess people are seeing that the past and present are also interconnected too.
Oh, I love that notion.
Yeah.
I love that notion about yes, it's a false dichotomy to think that there's a past and a present that have no implication in one another.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. Thank you. Okay, Mark Thompson.
I'm looking at the painting, and my first impression of it is I saw an hourglass split, and that to me, as we get older and as our memory fades, sometimes there's a disparity between the truth and the affect, is what Richard was saying, the affect and the actual event. And so to me, it's saying that we've got a certain amount of time within which to recall our memories and do something with them. I think it's a very powerful image, and it's helpful. It's helpful to me. I had a question. I'm assuming that it's Moses who's narrating this parasha as a continuation from Ve'et Hanan. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. The part that I find interesting is verse 7, where now Moses is talking about what you're going to see once you get into the land. And it's almost prophetic. I mean, it's what Israel is now: fountains rising from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, of vine, figs, pomegranate. None of this was there when they came into the land. So I just find it interesting that he's turned very prophetic here, as opposed to relying only on reciting events of the past in order to elicit memories for the future. I thought that part was interesting. I'd like to see if there are any comments you have about either of my two comments.
Okay, so first of all, very rich comments. Here's what you made me think about. And if Mark Levinstein wants to join in, I invite him to do so from his work in geriatrics, which is that when we do have some break, if you will, in terms of our memory and our incapacity to recall in detail many things, what some neuroscientists have discovered is that one of the modalities that people, even in extreme forms of memory loss, one of the modalities that people are able to reattach to is music. Wow. Right? And so I share that with you as a troubadour, a purveyor of music. So that's very beautiful.
By the way, just sorry to interrupt, but just to add to that point, when I used to work with stroke patients who had lost their speech, they were not able to produce sounds connected together to make a sentence. But if, for example, I played a Mitch Miller album, they were able to sing Mitch Miller songs with perfect fluency because of the melody that produced that conduit. The two sides of the brain work together. It was fascinating.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And let me just, the other aspect of what you said, Paul and David, which is I noticed as we were reading through our portion this evening, when it was describing the promised land, it used the phrase kol bo. Everything is in it, it says. And that what it made me think about is that moment at when Jacob and Esau reunite after being apart from 20 years. And Esau says, here, take some of what I have. I have a lot. And Jacob says, oh, I have everything. Meaning not that he was materially wealthy, but now that he's reunited with his brother, now that he has made, if you will, a repair of his relationship with his brother, now that he's restored the blessing that he took from his brother, he's able to say, I'm full, I have everything now. And so that description of Kobo, of everything is in it, this notion about the promised land being a place where we'll be satisfied. That's the state of being that we'll be in. Not just that it's a physical geographic place where there's all this food, but to cross over from the wilderness into this other state of being is where we have everything that we need and we no longer covet.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, David.
Maybe the relationship of history and its factuality to remembrance and its irrationality is similar to the relationship of speech and music that you and Mark are talking about, but maybe not.
Go ahead, Richard.
To connect these two, you talked about uniting the two hemispheres of the brain of people who are sadly gone a little bit with the music and the words. And I just thought about thou shalt have a sign between the eyes, in front of the pituitary, but between the two hemispheres, to unite these two variant ways of experiencing the universe and to listen.
Wow, I hadn't thought about that part of it. Thank you so much. Well, Susan, go ahead.
So I find personally that sometimes I do things not understanding why I'm doing it, but rather knowing that it's what I'm supposed to do, whether I've been told so by a parent, a spouse, a sibling, the Torah, whatever. And when I do it, I find meaning in it and purpose. So that is what I sometimes get out of the we will do and we will hear.
Very
and
lovely.
I'm also reminded that one of my favorite scenes from any movie, and I don't even remember anything else about the movie, but the movie Shenandoah opens with Jimmy Stewart sitting at a table with all of his family, his grown children and their spouses and their children. And he does this very long blessing before they start to eat that says, well, God, we cleared the land ourselves and we plowed the land ourselves and we planted the land ourselves and we weeded the land ourselves and we harvested the crop ourselves and we prepared the food ourselves. But I promised my dear departed wife that I would thank you every night before I ate.
Oh, that's lovely, because not only does that tie the family to a source outside of itself, if you want to call it God, but also ties him personally to his beloved, to his intimate, and restores her presence. That's really sweet. Thank you very much for sharing that. Okay. And anyone else would like to share? Okay, Sherry, here.
Well, when in our passage, we were talking about what it's going to be like to enter the land, about that unlike a vegetable garden, that the rains will come and everything else. And as you know, our daughter lives in Israel, and Israel has a lot of ecological problems. And I was just sorrowful that for whatever reason, I mean, there have been different groups conquering this group and that group and so on and so forth, that a lot of the description of what the land was at one time, it clearly isn't anymore because of environmental degradation.
So I think that goes part of what Daniel was saying, which is we have these false dichotomies, as if nature is one thing and we humans are something else. And that there's no mutual impact on one another, which of course we now know is completely false, right? So lovely to bring in that notion about the climate and the environment and how we're in this ecosystem. We're just part of an ecosystem rather than the ecosystem being separate and detached from us. So thank you for that. Okay. And okay.
Yeah, this is also in chapter 7. The Lord your God will dislodge those people before you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them at once, else wild beasts would multiply to your hurt. And I've always puzzled over that. And it just seems to me there's something going on in the land that needs to be taken care of. And it can't all be done at once. You have to attend to these wild beasts, same as in Job, and all so many cattle, that there's other stuff going on here, which is going to be your responsibility. I can hold the ground for a while and take away part of them, but you're still going to have to deal with the wild beasts, which could be ecology, which could be whatever it is that's out there that we have to be mindful of and take direction over to help out.
Wow. Thank you, Richard. And then
Jonah.
What's that?
I think it was Jonah, not Job.
Yeah, Jonah. Thank you. Okay.
Yes.
And others thought. So I'll come back to Mark Thompson. Do you have any response or reply to Margot's request? Or if you remember Shir Hamalop, you want to share that with us? You have to unmute if you like to do. Okay. All right. And anyone else like to share? All right. So Barry? Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I'm from reading the Torah portion, I'm reminded of a book I read by Charles Mann, 1491, and he chronicles the pestilence that destroyed the indigenous population of the Americas before the white man really settled the area. So the native population was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed before the white man ever engaged with them. And this is what the Torah is saying about the indigenous populations of Canaan, that I'll destroy them by pestilence before you have to conquer them by sword. It's kind of, I guess that is a sort of process in history that we don't maybe recognize enough. The fact that when new populations come in contact with each other, there was a tendency to initiate pestilence and plagues because there was a lack of immunity to those diseases.
No, point well taken in terms of viewing the historical nature of our lives, that form of colonizing and bringing into the host, if you will, some new virus and that the body is not prepared to repel. Right, that certainly happens. And go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead and finish your thought, and then I'll speak for Margot.
Okay, so I was just thinking that when I was reading it, again, I'm reading it from not this being a book of history, but a book of meaning. And the notion that when you cross over into this new dimension, not a geographic place, but a new dimension of being, that we will have the way cleared away from us of all these foreign irritants, because we will be in a different state of being. We will no longer, as I mentioned before, have a sense of coveting, or as Richard was saying, we'll be at that point in our lives where we'll no longer need to expand, because we will be fully realized human beings that don't require taking things away from others. So it's a slightly different way of viewing the material and the meaning that it's trying to convey to us. Let me call Cheryl and then we'll get to Mark Thompson. Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
Rabbi, your comment just now in connection with what Barry said, and I highly recommend that book, led me to think about, I read a lot of science fiction, that the idea that you cleanse a land or you cleanse a planet and then you bring your people in and they completely take it over. That is what Western Europeans did coming to the Americas. And listening to the radio today continues to do it all the way through the 70s and the 80s. If you're listening to what's going on in Canada with the Indigenous peoples. And that would be their justification. That looking back at this portion, God said, clean it out, kill everybody, don't take anything that they have, make it be ash, and then it's your land of milk and honey. And that, when I think about it, is exactly what the Western Europeans did with respect to this hemisphere.
Right. So this is the problem that happens when we live in a material world, and not just a spiritual world, where Jews in immediately after World War II, for example, are faced with, we're totally vulnerable. We have no way to protect ourselves with any sense of sovereignty. And so we need a state that can protect us and an army that's dedicated to protecting us, right? So that's the material reality that the people were facing. The question that was always raised, especially within the Orthodox world, if you will, was, are we spiritually at the level where the material state that we are going to create will be a state that meets the level that we're supposed to be at as human beings? So we were having a discussion before we came online this evening here in Portland, which is that I was telling folks that when the state of Israel was in the process of being created, my grandfather, who was part of the Hasidic world view, if you will, said to my mother, I don't know, maybe we should wait for the Mashiach to come before we create the state of Israel. And by that, he didn't mean let's wait until there is this figure called the Messiah who's going to say, okay, now's the time to create a state of Israel. What he meant was what also the great Jewish philosopher Ahad Ha'am said, which is we need not only to create a state of Jews, we need to create a Jewish state, meaning that we need to create a country that embodies Jewish values. And so that's what my grandfather, I think, was getting at, which is, are we really at the level of human development that it can create the kind of country that will reflect our highest values? And so that's what he was concerned about. And this is the quandary that we face.
And that is a pivoting thought for Israel.
That is what?
A pivoting thought. That is one of the things that Israel is pivoting on, is whether it's one of the things that we as Americans tend to hold over them. It's, well, certainly as Reformed as I am, it's like there's a higher power that you should be answering to, that is higher moral levels, higher expectation.
Okay, and then one final thing that you got me to think of, and then we'll turn it over to Mark Thompson, is this, which is that because we've been talking also about the George Floyd, and so I just want to remember that the civil rights movement, especially of the 50s and 60s, was not just a movement seeking certain political rights and to accomplish certain issue-oriented goals. It was a moral movement. that sought to transform and revitalize and redeem, if you will, this entire country from the original sin of slavery. So that is trying to infuse moments of history with also moments of morality, which is transcendent values. So thank you very much for that. Mark Thompson, what would you like to share with us?
First, I'd like to say that in doing a small portion of Birkat Hamazon, I want to say to you, Rabbi, that we are satiated by your teachings, and all of us take great pleasure in each other's company, and that we're able to meet like this on Thursday and really enrich our lives. So thanks to you and thanks to all of us.
This is our meal, and after the meal,
Yeah. Shir hamalot b'shuv Adonai et shivat Zion hayinu kechomim az yimalei sot pinu ulshonenu rina az yomru v'hagoyim higdal Adonai lasot imele higdal Adonai lasot imanu Hayinu smechim.
thank
You so much, everyone, for joining around the shulchan, the table, feasting on the presence of Torah, the presence of one another. As Margot put it so beautifully, we are sated around this meal of companionship, fellowship, and purpose. Thank you all so much. I look forward to our next meal together. Be well, everyone. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
thank you, Mark.
Welcome, Margot.